They say a man can live alone long enough to forget the sound of another voice, but the land never forgets the day blood touches his fence. For 15 years, Elias Crow had kept his world measured and quiet. Every inch of it fenced with cedar posts he cut himself. Every sunrise greeted with the same silence that had settled into his bones like dust. No visitors. No questions. No past following him across the plains. Just the wind, the cattle, and the slow creak of wood under heat that climbed past 90 degrees by noon. He liked it that way. Or at least, he had learned not to need anything else. The morning it happened. The light came in low and pale, stretching long shadows across the yard like fingers reaching for something they couldn't quite touch. Elias stood on his porch, a tin cup of black coffee cooling in his hand, watching the horizon the way he always did, slow, patient, expecting nothing. Out here, nothing ever changed. That was the deal he made with the land. He wouldn't ask for more, and it wouldn't give him trouble. Then he saw it. Not movement. Not at first. Just a color that didn't belong. A dark stain smeared along the top rail of his fence, about 30 yards out. Elias didn't move right away. He had learned the cost of moving too quickly years ago, back when decisions came with consequences that didn't fade. Instead, he set the cup down on the porch rail, the metal clicking softly against the wood, and narrowed his eyes against the glare. The stain wasn't old. The sun hadn't baked it dry yet. It caught the light wrong, too heavy, too thick to be mud. He stepped off the porch, boots hitting the packed dirt with a dull thud, each step measured, unhurried. The distance between him and the fence felt longer than it was, stretched thin by something he couldn't name. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint scent that didn't belong to cattle or dust or dry grass. It stopped him halfway there. He stood still, listening. Not for sound. There wasn't any. The silence was too complete, like the land itself was holding its breath. Elias exhaled slowly and kept walking. When he got closer, the stain resolved into something clearer, something undeniable. Blood, fresh enough to still glisten where the sun hadn't touched it. His jaw tightened, not in fear, but in recognition. Trouble didn't knock out here. It left marks. He followed the line of it along the fence until he saw her. She was crumpled just beyond the posts, half in the shade, half in the harsh morning light, like the land itself hadn't decided whether to claim her or cast her out. Dark hair tangled with dust. One hand still gripping the lower rail, as if she had tried to pull herself over and failed. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, but it was there. Alive. Elias stopped about 20 feet away. Close enough to see the rise and fall of her chest. Far enough to turn back if he chose to. His hand hovered near the rifle slung over his shoulder, not reaching, just resting in the space where instinct lived. 15 years of solitude had taught him one rule above all others. Don't get involved. He could turn around now. Walk back to the porch. Pick up his coffee. Let the land take its course the way it always had. The world outside his fence wasn't his concern. It never had been. The woman stirred, a small movement, barely more than a shift of weight, but enough to catch his eye. Her fingers tightened on the wood for a second before slipping loose. Her head turned just enough for him to see her face, pale under the dust, eyes still closed but tense, as if even unconscious she expected something worse than the ground beneath her. Elias felt something old and unwelcome move in his chest, something he had buried deep enough to forget its name. He didn't step forward. Not yet. The fence stood between them, simple wood and wire, something he had built to mark a boundary. His land. Not his land. His life. Not his life. He had believed in that line for a long time. Believed it kept things where they belonged. But standing there now, watching a stranger bleed into the space between those posts, Elias realized the truth came quieter than he expected. The line had already been crossed. Not by her. By something else entirely. He stayed where he was, boots planted in the dirt like roots he had never meant to grow, his eyes fixed on the woman beyond the fence, as if looking long enough might change what. He was seeing. The wind picked up again, brushing through the dry grass in low whispers, carrying the faint rustle of her clothing against the wood where she had collapsed. Elias did not like the sound. It was too human, too fragile, the kind of sound that asked for something without using words. He shifted his weight slightly, the leather of his gun belt creaking, and let his gaze move past her for the first time, scanning the open stretch beyond the fence line. The land rolled out wide and empty, sunlit and unforgiving. But something about it felt different now, like a stage that had been waiting for actors he never invited. He crouched slowly, not taking his eyes off the horizon, and touched the dirt just inside his side of the fence. It was disturbed. Not much, but enough. A heel mark, pressed deep and uneven, like someone had stumbled or been forced to stop. He followed it with his eyes, tracing a faint path that led back toward the woman. She had not wandered here by accident. She had come from somewhere, and whatever had followed her had not bothered to hide its trail. Elias straightened, the movement deliberate, controlled, as he measured the distance again. 20 feet. Maybe a step more. Close enough to reach if he chose to. Far enough to pretend he had not seen her. His jaw tightened as he looked down at the fence, at the simple rail that separated his life from everything he had left behind. He had built it with his own hands, post by post, hammering it into the ground with a kind of stubborn certainty that borders on belief. This side was his. That side was not. The rule had held for 15 years. It had kept the world quiet. It had kept him breathing. The woman moved again, a small, involuntary motion that broke the stillness like a stone dropped into water. Her hand twitched against the dirt, fingers curling as if reaching for something that was no longer there. A faint sound escaped her lips, not a word, just breath catching where it should have been steady. Elias felt it before he understood it, a pull that did not belong to reason or memory, something older than both. He took one step forward, then stopped. The space between them felt heavier now, thick with something. Unspoken, like the air before a storm that never shows itself until it is already too late. He glanced back toward the house, toward the porch where his coffee sat cooling, untouched. For a moment, he imagined turning around, walking back, letting the distance close behind him like it always had. The image held for exactly one breath. Then it broke. He exhaled slowly and stepped closer to the fence, close enough now to see the fine details he had missed before. The fabric of her dress was worn, stitched by hand, marked by travel and weather. There was dirt on her skin, yes, but also something else, something deliberate, as if she had tried to hide herself from eyes that knew how to look. Her face, even in stillness, carried tension, not fear alone, but something sharper, something that spoke of pride held tight, even when the body could no longer follow. Elias rested one hand lightly on the top rail of the fence. The wood was warm under his palm, steady, familiar. He had trusted it for years, trusted it to hold the line. He looked at her again, at the way her body lay half-turned toward his land, as if whatever strength she had left had been spent reaching this exact place, and no further. He could see it clearly now. She had not fallen anywhere. She had chosen here. The thought settled into him like weight, slow and undeniable. This was not chance. This was not the land doing what it always did. This was a decision, made by someone who had nothing left to spend except the direction of her last steps. Elias tightened his grip on the wood, feeling the grain press into his skin, grounding him in something real. The rule was simple. Do not get involved. But standing there, with the sun climbing and the silence stretching thinner by the second, he understood something he had avoided for a long time. Rules were easy when the world stayed outside. Harder when it came to your fence and left its mark where you could not ignore it. He looked once more at the horizon, then back at the woman, and the distance between those two things told him everything he needed to know. He did not sigh. He did not curse. He just let go of the rail, stepped forward, and reached for the space he had spent 15 years refusing to cross. The moment his boot crossed the line, the world did not change, but something inside him did, quiet and final, like a door closing somewhere far behind him. Elias moved with care, stepping around the lower rail instead of over it, as if respecting the boundary even while breaking it, his eyes never leaving the woman as he closed the distance between them. Up close, the details sharpened, every small thing carrying weight it did not have from afar. The dust on her skin was not just from the ground. It was pressed in, smeared in places like she had tried to hide herself or erase a trail. Her breathing came shallow, uneven, each rise of her chest measured like it cost her something to keep going. Elias lowered himself slowly to one knee, not too close, not yet, leaving a space between them that felt necessary, like a pause in a conversation neither of them had agreed to start. He did not reach for her immediately. He had learned that touch, out here, meant more than intention. It meant claim, or threat, or something that could not be taken back. He let his gaze move over her carefully, not searching for answers, just taking in what was there. Her hands were rough, not soft, marked by work and time, and her fingers curled slightly inward as if still holding onto something invisible. There was a small tear along the side of her sleeve, and beneath it, the skin carried a faint line where the fabric had caught and given way. Not fresh, not severe, but enough to tell a story of movement that had not been gentle. Elias exhaled slowly, steadying himself, and shifted a few inches closer. That was when her eyes opened. It was not sudden. It was not dramatic. Just a slow, deliberate lifting, like someone surfacing from deep water and not yet certain what waited above. Her gaze found him immediately. Not wandering. Not confused. Direct. Sharp. Alive in a way the rest of her body was not. Elias froze where he was, one hand resting on his knee, the other hanging loose at his side. He had seen that look before, years ago, in men who had nothing left but the will to decide how their story ended. It was not fear. It was not trust. It was something in between, something that measured and judged in the same breath. She did not speak. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. Instead, her eyes moved, quick and precise, taking in his face, his posture, the distance between them, the fence behind him, the open land beyond. Calculating. Elias kept his hands where she could see them, open, empty, the way a man does when he wants to show he is not reaching for anything. The silence stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable, like both of them understood that words would only complicate what was already clear. He tilted his head slightly, not a question, not an invitation, just an acknowledgement that he saw her as she was, not as a problem to be solved. Her gaze lingered on him for a long moment, then shifted past him, toward the house, the barn, the line of the fence that marked the edge of his world. Something flickered there, too quick to name, before her eyes returned to his. When she finally moved, it was small, controlled, but deliberate. Her hand lifted a few inches from the dirt, hesitated, then dropped again, the effort too much to complete. But the meaning was clear. She was not asking. She was deciding. Elias felt the weight of that choice settle between them. He leaned forward just enough to close the distance by another inch, his voice low when he finally spoke, the first words his land had heard from him in days. "I am not going to hurt you." The words hung there, simple and unadorned, carrying no promise beyond what they were. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in doubt, but in consideration, as if weighing the truth of something that could not be proven. Then, almost imperceptibly, the tension in her shoulders shifted, not gone, but altered, like a bowstring eased just enough to breathe. It was not trust. Not yet. But it was not refusal either. Elias nodded once, more to himself than to her, and let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. He reached forward then, slow, steady, giving her time to pull away if she chose to. She did not. His hand paused just above her arm for a fraction of a second, a final moment where he could still turn back. Then he made contact, light, careful, as if touching something that carried more than its own weight. And in that touch, quiet and restrained, the distance between two worlds narrowed by less than an inch, but enough to matter. The contact was light, but it carried weight far beyond the pressure of his hand, and Elias felt it the moment his fingers settled against her arm, a subtle tension beneath her skin, not resistance, not acceptance, something held tightly in place by will alone. He did not grip. He did not pull. He simply stayed there for a breath, letting her feel that he was real, that he was not forcing anything she had not already allowed. Her eyes remained on his, sharp and unblinking, searching for something that could not be spoken. Elias shifted slightly, lowering himself closer to her level, his movements slow enough to give her time to change her mind. She did not move away. That was all the permission he was going to get. He slid his other hand beneath her shoulder, careful, deliberate, and began to lift. She was lighter than he expected, not weak, but worn down, like someone who had spent more strength than she had to spare just to reach this place. As he raised her, her body tensed for a brief second, a reflex, then eased again, not into comfort, but into necessity. Her head turned slightly, resting just enough to keep her balance, but her eyes never left his face. Elias stood, steadying her weight against him, feeling the shift of gravity, the way her presence changed the space around him. For 15 years, nothing had leaned on him like this. Nothing had needed him in a way that could not be ignored. He adjusted his hold, keeping his hands where they were needed and nowhere else, and turned toward the fence. The wood stood there, quiet and unchanged, as if it had not just lost its meaning. He stepped forward and guided her carefully through the gap between the rails, moving slow enough that each step could be corrected if she faltered. She did not speak. Neither did he. The silence between them was not empty anymore. It was full, dense with awareness, with choices already made and consequences still unfolding. Once inside, Elias paused, glancing back over his shoulder, out toward the open land beyond the fence. The horizon looked the same as it always had. Wide. Empty. But he knew better now. Something had moved through it. Something had followed her here, whether he could see it yet or not. He turned back and continued toward the house. Each step measured, his boots pressing into the dirt with a weight that felt different than it had an hour ago. The porch creaked under his weight as he climbed the steps, the familiar sound grounding him in something solid, something that had not changed. He nudged the door open with his shoulder and stepped inside, bringing her into a space that had not held another person in longer than he cared to count. The air inside was cooler, shaded, carrying the faint scent of wood and thyme. He moved to the small bed against the far wall and lowered her onto it with care, easing her down until she lay back, her breathing still shallow but steadier now that she was no longer fighting to stay upright. Elias stepped back immediately, giving her space, his hands dropping to his sides, as if to show that whatever he had done ended there. She turned her head slightly, her gaze moving across the room, taking in the details with the same quiet precision she had used outside. The table, the stove, the single chair. Nothing extra, nothing wasted. Her eyes returned to him, and for a moment, something softer passed through them. Not trust, not yet, but a recognition that she was no longer lying in the dirt. Elias nodded once, a small, almost invisible motion, and reached for the canteen hanging by the door. He poured water into a tin cup, the sound of it echoing softly in the quiet room, then set it within her reach without stepping too close. He did not offer it with words. He did not ask if she needed it. He simply made it available, the way the land offered what it had without promise. As he straightened, a faint sound drifted in from outside, carried on the wind, subtle enough that most would miss it. Elias did not. He turned his head slightly, listening, his expression tightening just enough to mark the change. Hoofbeats. Distant. Measured. Not rushing. Not lost. Coming this way. The sound did not hurry, and that was what made it worse. Steady hoofbeats rolling across the open land with the patience of men who already knew where they were going. Elias stood still for a moment, head slightly tilted, letting the rhythm settle into him, counting without meaning to, one, then another, until he knew there were at least 3 horses out there, maybe more, spaced just enough to move as a group without crowding each other. He set the tin cup down on the table without looking, the metal tapping softly against wood, and turned toward the door. The room behind him stayed quiet, but he could feel her attention shift, not with panic, not with surprise, but with something sharper, something that had been waiting for this moment long before she reached his fence. He stepped out onto the porch, the sunlight hitting him full as the wind carried the sound clearer now. Closer, no more than a mile out, maybe less. The land stretched wide in front of him, but this time it did not feel empty. It felt watched. He moved down the steps and walked a few yards into the yard, stopping where he could see the approach clearly, his posture relaxed, but not careless, hands loose at his sides, not reaching for the rifle, not yet. Dust rose in the distance, thin at first, then thicker as the shapes of riders began to form against the horizon, dark figures moving with purpose, not rushing, not hesitating. They knew this place, or they knew enough to come straight to it. Elias narrowed his eyes, studying the line of their movement, the way they held their spacing, the way their heads stayed level, scanning without turning too much, men used to reading land without announcing it. He did not recognize them, but he recognized the type. Not drifters, not lost travelers, men who followed something until it ended. Behind him, the door creaked softly as it shifted in the breeze, and he did not turn, but he knew she was awake, knew she was listening, measuring the same distance, counting the same beats. He let his gaze drop briefly to the ground near the fence, tracing the faint trail he had seen earlier, the disturbed dirt, the uneven prints that now made more sense with the sound approaching. They had not been far behind her. Maybe they had seen her fall. Maybe they had let her. The thought settled cold and quiet. Elias lifted his head again, watching as the riders came closer, now within half a mile, their outlines clearer, hats low, shoulders steady, horses moving like they had been on this trail for hours without slowing. He took a slow breath, filling his lungs with dry air that tasted like dust and sun, and let it out just as slowly. 15 years without trouble had taught him something simple. Trouble does not ask permission. It arrives and waits to see what you do. He shifted his stance slightly, turning just enough to place himself between the house and the open land, not as a challenge, not as a threat, just a fact. This was where he stood. The riders slowed as they reached the outer edge of his property, their horses easing down from a steady pace to something more deliberate, hooves pressing softer into the dirt, raising less dust now, as if they understood the line they were crossing without needing it marked. They did not call out. They did not wave. They simply kept coming until they were close enough to see him clearly, then stopped, spread out in a loose line about 30 yards from the fence. 3 of them, all watching. Elias met their gaze without moving, his face unreadable, his hands still at his sides. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint creak of leather and the quiet breath of horses, the kind of silence that comes not from absence, but from restraint. No one spoke. No one reached for anything. The moment stretched, thin and sharp, balanced on something that had not yet been decided. And behind him, inside the house, the presence he had brought across his fence lay still, waiting, knowing that whatever came next would not be asked twice. No one moved first, and that was the point, the kind of stillness that only exists when every man involved understands that the next action will matter more than anything that came before it. Elias stood where he had placed himself, between the house and the riders, not blocking the door, not guarding it in any obvious way, just existing in that space like a fact they would have to consider. The 3 men sat their horses easy, not tense, not relaxed, the kind of balance that comes from knowing how quickly things can shift without needing to prove it. One of them tilted his head slightly, studying Elias with a patience that felt older than the moment, as if measuring not just the man in front of him, but the ground he stood on, the house behind him, the quiet that wrapped around all of it. The wind carried a faint sound from behind Elias, the soft scrape of movement inside the house, and though he did not turn, he felt it, a reminder that this was no longer just about him and the land. He had brought something across his fence, and now the fence meant nothing at all. The rider in the center shifted in his saddle just enough to draw attention without making a show of it, his horse stepping forward half a pace before settling again, the movement controlled, deliberate. When he finally spoke, his voice did not rise, did not carry like a challenge. It simply reached the distance between them and stopped there. "We are looking for someone." Elias did not answer right away. He let the words sit in the air, not ignoring them, not accepting them, just giving them the same weight the riders had given their silence. He glanced briefly at the ground between them, at the line of dirt that marked where his land began, then lifted his eyes back to the man. "People pass through here sometimes," he said, his voice even, steady, offering nothing more than what the words held. The rider's gaze did not change, but something behind it sharpened, a slight narrowing that suggested he had expected that answer and found nothing in it to dismiss. "This one did not pass through," the man said, and there was no accusation in it, just certainty, the kind that does not need to be proven. "She came this way." Elias felt the words settle into the space between them, not loud, not forceful, but heavy enough to carry meaning. He did not look back at the house. He did not shift his stance. He simply stood there, letting the truth exist without giving it shape. The riders did not press closer. They did not reach for anything at their sides. They waited, the way men wait when they believe time is already on their side. Elias took a slow breath, the dry air filling his chest, and let it out without hurry. He could feel the choice now, clearer than before, not hidden behind distance or silence. If he stepped aside, if he said nothing, if he allowed them to walk past him and into the house, this moment would end quickly. The land would return to what it had been. Quiet. Unchanged. If he did not, then whatever came next would not leave things the way they were. He looked at the man in the center again, at the calm certainty in his posture, at the way his hands rested where they could move if needed but had not yet done so. Then he spoke, not louder, not harder, just enough to be heard. "No one here asked for you." The words did not challenge. They did not threaten. They simply drew a line that could not be mistaken. The wind moved through the space between them, carrying dust and thin, shifting lines across the ground, as if even the land was waiting to see which way this would turn. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the man in the center leaned back slightly in his saddle, his gaze still fixed on Elias, and something changed, not in the way he looked, but in what he allowed himself to understand. This was not a man who would step aside because it was easier. This was a man who had already chosen which side of the fence he stood on. And behind that quiet realization, something else followed, something none of them said out loud. If they took another step forward, they would not just be crossing land. They would be crossing into a decision that could not be undone. The wind shifted again, slower this time, dragging dust in thin lines across the ground, as if the land itself was trying to soften what stood between them. But nothing softened, not the distance, not the silence, not the weight of three riders waiting for one man to move. Elias did not move. He did not reach for the rifle resting by the porch, though he knew exactly how far it was, knew the angle, the time it would take, the outcome it would bring. That was not the kind of ending he had lived 15 years to avoid. The man in the center studied him a moment longer, then let his gaze drift, not to the house directly, but to the space around it, the small details that told a story without words, the fresh track near the steps, the disturbed dust, the faint mark where a door had opened not long ago. He saw enough. They always did. The man leaned forward slightly in his saddle, resting his forearms on the horn, his posture easing not in surrender, but in understanding, like a man who had just confirmed what he already knew. "She does not belong here," he said, and this time the words carried something deeper, not anger, not accusation, but something close to warning, quiet and steady. Elias kept his eyes on him, letting the sentence settle before answering. "Neither do I," he said, just as calm, just as certain, and for a brief moment, something almost like recognition passed between them, two men standing in a place neither one had truly chosen, both bound by something older than the moment itself. One of the riders on the left shifted in his saddle, the leather creaking softly, his gaze flicking toward the house and back again, less patient than the one in the center, his hand resting closer to his hip, not moving, but ready if the line broke. The third rider said nothing at all, his eyes fixed on Elias with a stillness that felt heavier than the others, like a man who understood that the outcome had already been decided, even if no one had spoken it yet. Inside the house, a faint movement, barely a sound, just enough to remind Elias that this was not just about standing his ground. It was about what stood behind him, about a woman who had chosen his fence as the place where her strength ended and his decision began. He felt it then, clear and sharp, the weight of what he had done, not as regret, not as doubt, but as something solid, something that would not shift no matter what came next. The man in the center straightened slightly, his gaze lifting from Elias to the horizon behind him, as if measuring time in something other than seconds, then back again. "If we turn back," he said slowly, the words deliberate, each one placed with care, "others will not. They will not ask. They will not wait." Elias nodded once, not in agreement, not in refusal, just acknowledging the truth of it. He had lived long enough to know that trouble did not travel alone, and it did. Not in just because one man chose to step away. "I am not asking you to," Elias said, his voice quiet, steady, carrying across the space between them without force. Another silence followed, longer this time, stretched thin over something neither side was willing to break. The wind moved again, lifting the edge of Elias's shirt, brushing past the riders, carrying with it the scent of dry grass, and something else, something faint from inside the house that did not belong to the land outside. The man in the center closed his eyes for a brief second, not in hesitation, but in decision, and when he opened them again, the weight in them had changed. He gave a small nod, more to himself than to Elias, then pulled his horse back half a step. The other two riders followed without question, the movement smooth, practiced, as if they had already agreed on this long before they arrived. They did not turn immediately. They did not rush away. They simply shifted, creating space where there had been none, a quiet acknowledgement that this ground, for now, would not be crossed. Elias did not relax. He did not step forward. He held his place, watching as they turned their horses in unison, the motion slow, controlled, like men who knew they were leaving something unfinished behind them. The dust rose again as they began to ride out, not fast, not slow, just steady, fading back into the land they had come from. And as the sound of their horses softened into the distance, Elias understood something that settled deeper than any fear. This was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something he had spent 15 years making sure would never find him. The dust settled slowly after the riders disappeared, drifting back to the earth as if nothing had ever disturbed it. But Elias did not move from where he stood, his eyes fixed on the empty stretch of land long after the last sound of hoofbeats had faded into silence. He waited, not out of fear, but out of habit, the kind that had kept him alive long enough to forget why he learned it in the first place. Only when the wind carried nothing but dry grass and distance did he turn back toward the house. The door stood slightly open, just as he had left it, a narrow line of shadow cutting across the threshold. Inside, the air held still, quiet, but not empty anymore. Elias stepped in without hurry, closing the door behind him with a soft push that sounded louder than it should have. She was sitting up now, not fully, but enough to lean against the wall, the blanket he had left folded nearby, pulled loosely around her shoulders. Her eyes were open, clearer than before, steady in a way that spoke of strength returning one breath at a time. She did not look surprised to see him. She did not ask what had happened outside. She had already known. Elias paused a few steps inside, giving her space, the same distance he had kept before, as if the line between them had simply moved from the fence to the room itself. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she reached slowly toward her neck, her fingers slipping beneath the edge of her clothing, and drew something out into the light. It was small, a piece of turquoise wrapped in thin silver, worn smooth by time, hanging from a leather cord darkened with age. She held it in her palm, letting it rest there where he could see it, not offering it, not hiding it. Elias stepped closer, just enough to bring it into clearer view, his eyes narrowing slightly, as something in his memory stirred, faint but insistent. He had seen something like it before. Not here. Not in this house. Somewhere older. Somewhere he had tried not to remember. She watched his face as he looked at it, not with expectation, but with a quiet certainty, as if the answer he was searching for had already been decided. "My grandmother wore this," she said, her voice low, steady, carrying a cadence different from his, shaped by a world that moved to another rhythm. She gave it to a man once. A stranger. He did not understand why. Elias felt the words settle into him slowly, each one finding its place before the next arrived. He did not reach for the pendant. He did not ask for it. He simply stood there, looking at it, then at her, then back again, as the memory shifted from shadow into something clearer. Years ago, before the fence, before the silence, before he chose this life, there had been a winter that did not end when it should have. A sickness that moved through the land without asking permission. A woman who had stayed when others left, who had known things no one else did. He had not known her name. He had not asked. He had only remembered the way her hands moved, steady and sure, and the way she had looked at him as if he was something worth saving when he did not believe it himself. He exhaled slowly, the sound quiet, but heavy with something he had not felt in years. "She saved my life," he said, the words coming without thought, pulled from a place he had buried deep enough to forget its shape. The woman nodded once, her gaze never leaving his, and for the first time, there was something in her expression that softened, not into trust, but into recognition, the kind that does not need time to grow because it was already there. "Then you already crossed this line long ago," she said, her voice calm, almost gentle, as if stating something simple, something obvious. Elias looked down briefly, at the floor, at the space between them, then back up again, and in that moment, he understood what the riders had seen that he had not. This was never about a stranger collapsing at his fence. This was about something that had started years ago, something that had found its way back to him whether he wanted it or not. He glanced toward the door, toward the land beyond it, and then back to her, the weight of what lay ahead settling into place with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Whatever had followed her here was not finished, and neither was he. Morning came without announcement, just a slow rise of light that slipped through the edges of the window and stretched across the floor like something careful not to wake what rested inside the room. Elias was already awake, sitting on the porch steps with his hands resting on his knees, watching the land the way he always had, but not the same way. The quiet was still there, the wind moving through the grass, the distant creak of wood as the heat began to build, but it no longer felt like something that belonged only to him. It felt shared. He did not turn when he heard the door behind him open, soft and steady, but he knew she was there, her presence settling into the space beside him without sound, without hesitation. She did not sit too close. She did not keep her distance either, just enough to exist in the same moment. They both looked out at the fence. It stood where it always had, the same posts, the same line cutting across the land, but something about it had changed in a way no one passing by would ever notice. The mark on the top rail had dried, darkened by the sun, no longer fresh, but not gone either. Elias let his gaze rest on it for a moment, then shifted to the horizon beyond, where the land stretched wide and open, carrying no sign of the riders who had come and gone the day before. No dust, no movement, just distance. She spoke first, her voice quiet, steady, shaped by the same calm that had carried her through everything that brought her here. They will not return today. Elias nodded once, not because he needed the reassurance, but because he understood what she was not saying. Not today did not mean not at all. The world beyond his fence was still moving, still turning towards something that would eventually find its way back. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his thighs, and looked down at the ground beneath his boots, the packed dirt marked by his steps, by hers, by the faint traces of everything that had crossed this place in the last 24 hours. For 15 years, he had kept this ground clean of anything that did not belong to him. No tracks stayed long. No story settled. Just wind and time. He reached down and brushed his hand lightly over the dirt, smoothing a small patch without thinking, the motion slow, almost absent. Then he stopped. His hand hovered there for a second before pulling back. He did not finish the motion. He let the marks remain. Beside him, she followed the movement, her eyes settling on the same place. And for a moment, something passed between them that did not need words. Not agreement. Not understanding. Just recognition. Elias straightened and looked at the fence again, at the line he had trusted for so long. And then, without hesitation, he stood. He walked toward it at an even pace, boots pressing into the ground with the same steady rhythm they always had. But this time there was no pause when he reached it. No measuring. No weighing. He placed one hand on the top rail, the wood warm under his palm, and pushed the gate open. The hinge gave a low, familiar sound, one he had heard countless times, but never like this. Not as something that invited instead of kept out. He stepped through and stopped on the other side, turning slightly to look back at the house, at her standing in the doorway now, watching him with that same steady gaze that had never once asked him to be anything other than what he chose. The distance between them was small, smaller than it had ever been. He did not call out. He did not gesture. He simply stood there, the open gate between them, the land stretching in both directions, no longer divided in the way it once was. After a moment, she moved, stepping down from the porch, crossing the yard with a pace that carried no urgency, no hesitation, and when she reached the fence, she did not stop. She passed through the open gate and came to stand beside him, not behind, not ahead. Beside. Elias looked out at the horizon again, the same line he had watched for 15 years, and for the first time, it did not feel like something distant. It felt like something he was already part of. The wind moved around them, quiet and steady, carrying no answers, no promises, just the sense that whatever came next would not need to announce itself. And Elias, standing there with the gate open behind him and the land in front of him, did not close it.